when Liesl first asked me if I would do this, I thought, oh yeah, no big deal. I'll read the bio and I'll say some of the wonderful things that are written up. And if you guys have read the bio that's in your binders, you know how impressive Bill Drayton is. And I also had planned to say something about what a great GW partner Bill Drayton has been. He's participated in a lot of our events. He wrote this fabulous afterword in our book on NGOs and the Millennium Development Goals. All of these things I could say, and I could go on and on and on. But truth be told, all of those things, no offense, they seem rather trivial right now. And I don't mean any offense to any of our other speakers that we're having throughout this week. But I do believe that of all the speakers that you are going to encounter this week in Washington, perhaps the most significant one is this gentleman, Bill Drayton. When I was coming into work yesterday morning, there was a little snippet on NPR about a graduation speech that, of course, now his name escapes me, but Jon Stewart, a graduation speech that Jon Stewart gave. I don't know if any of you guys heard it. It was just a little snippet. Apparently, he said to this graduating class, well, everybody tells you go out and change the world, but please don't do that, because some of us like it the way it is. I don't think that's true. And I really don't. And if you want to think about the people in the world who have made the greatest differences, you will have the privilege of hearing from one of them today. And what Bill Drayton maybe doesn't fully realize is that beyond the work that he does at Ashoka, directly and indirectly supporting social entrepreneurs, he also inspires so many of us, myself included, and many, many, many students. And on that note, I want to ask Liesl to say a few words.
Well, the truth is, a couple of years ago, this book that was on your chair was being published, and the author, David Bornstein, came with Bill Drayton to GW for a presentation, and I just happened to attend. I didn't really know much about social entrepreneurship, but I thought it would be interesting to kind of go learn about it. And you'll see in the book features many of the great Ashoka fellows and their business concepts and the impacts that they've had in their countries that they're working in. And they gave some snippets of that. I was so inspired. I immediately went back and created a whole module for the Managing Developing Countries class around the social entrepreneurship theme. And every semester I end on that note. And I was saying to Bill, when he came in this morning, I said, when I just was teaching this the last time to undergraduates, everyone is always on that last day very inspired by these materials. But that particular class, when I was lecturing, I was really annoyed because I had that one student in the room with that laptop up and running, click, 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 the whole time I'm talking. And I'm thinking, he is Facebooking while I'm talking about the most important thing of the whole semester. And so I get more dramatic and more, because you know how I do in my sort of homily mode, and I still click, 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 click the whole time. I was so annoyed with that student, and I went back to my office, and there sitting an email from that very student. He had been writing me an email during the class, and it was this long stream of consciousness email about how he had been up all night after reading these materials, and he was completely changing his life, leaving. He was a salesman. He was going to quit being a salesman. He was going to drop the for-profit world and become a social entrepreneur. And I have to tell you, I have heard this kind of story over and over again about how these materials really make my students think about in new ways about what they want to do with their lives and how they want to make the world a better place. So it's one of the major reasons why I've carved out such a large portion of our programming for, I think, this very, very important topic. And the only reason I am leaving the room right now is because I have to go teach some of those great students and spread more of this word. So I know you will enjoy today's talk, and I look forward to joining you later on in the afternoon.
Thank you. So, Bill, without further ado, please. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My understanding is that everyone here has the opportunity to change how students are taught, how business schools and some other departments do their work. And so this is, when you go through a major change in the structure of society, you have a very important role to help not only those students, the disciplines and society as a whole see the change. And so I think we are living right now through the biggest change in the strategic environment since the agricultural revolution. And if you look just at the social entrepreneurs or any other piece and don't see the larger strategic change, you can't explain it. Now, Pierre Omidyar, who's the founder of eBay, 4 or 5 years ago, asked us, what are you trying to do? We said, we're trying to build an entrepreneurial competitive citizen sector, which is what that last chapter is about. And he said, no, that sounds like an intermediate goal. What are you really trying to do? And so we thought about it, and that has really transformed the clarity for us of what we're doing. And so what I hope to do is share with you first that change in the strategic environment that affects every sector of society. What is that? Agricultural revolution produced a small surplus, and so only a few people could move into Jericho. And for the last 12 or 14,000 years, we have lived in a world with a few players. Only a few people could actually be participants. Everyone else was the invisible supports. And the inertia behind that system, family expectations, education, how we manage all institutions, is enormous. It's all based on the assumption of a few players, but it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work for the individuals, and it doesn't work for institutions or for society. So what I hope to do as 1/3 of this is help draw out what that historical change is. Now, to understand it, there's a building block that's very important in the change, and that's the social entrepreneurs, and behind them, the new entrepreneurial competitive citizen sector. And so, since that's the topic of this conversation, but also because it's very key to understanding the larger picture, and spend some time on that, trying to understand who these people are, how would you identify them, how does this mechanism work? And then finally, coming around to the relevance to everyone in this room. And since my understanding is that most people who are here from business schools are going to focus on that more than other areas, but when you have this sort of a change, it affects everything. So let me start with the social entrepreneurs, because understanding that makes it easier to understand the rest. What is the most powerful force in the world? It's pretty clear. It's a big idea, but only if it's in the hands of an entrepreneur. It's that combination that moves things. And it doesn't matter what the sector is, it's that same dynamic. And so a social entrepreneur is the same as the entrepreneur that creates a new business system, a new industry. It is not the local tobacconist. You could say business was really, really boring and never accomplished anything if you only focused on the 99% that didn't change the pattern. But of course, it's that small, tiny percent who really changed the pattern that we're talking about. So there's a tendency to say about social entrepreneurs, not very important, drop in the ocean. You realize that it's the major entrepreneurs we're talking about here. So what I want to do is introduce you to two of them with two purposes. I hope you will challenge yourself as we go through these two examples. What are the common elements? Could you identify one if you met one in the street? It's a very useful, what are the key factors? And we'll come around and try and draw those out. Now, I hope I do this right. Brilliant. And the second purpose is that I've chosen these two examples because the subject matter will play into later themes as well. Mary Gordon is a Canadian Ashoka Fellow elected about 3 years ago. And she saw a problem, and she gave herself permission to see the problem, and she gave herself permission, I'm going to change the whole system. She saw that she's a teacher in Toronto. She saw increasingly was that children would come and have no response pattern other than aggression when they were uncomfortable, which of course invites aggression back. You cycle that every time it happens, it gets deeper. And the probability of those children being able to function in modern society is extremely low. The probability of those schools being functional schools is very low. And so she said, this is a problem bigger than anything in my lesson plan. How am I going to change the system? She's gone from 2 schools to a couple of thousand, New Zealand, the state of Hesse in Germany, maybe Seattle. So she's well into the spread process. The Canadians have a measure of bullying rates. They come down and they stay down after her intervention is done. To change the school system, it better be very simple and not too demanding. So all she asks is 1 hour a month for 8 months. And so what happens? She brings an infant who at the beginning of the year is less than 1 year old, plus mom, who is the professor. And the students, not the teacher, have the responsibility of figuring out what the professor is, A, saying, and later feeling. And as she describes it, this is a limbic learning. Kids totally get into it, and you get these very dramatic results. Now, why is this important? Well, it's obviously important for the 2 reasons I mentioned, but there's a deeper reason and that feeds into this transition from a world of a few players to a world where everyone has to be a change maker. If you, as a young child, do not master empathy, and now sophisticated empathy, what the psychologists call cognitive empathy, you are not going to be able to play. You will be marginalized in the full, horrible sense of that word. Why? Because the faster the world changes and the more moving pieces there are, the rules cover less and less. And we rely on the people around us to do no harm and, if possible, to do as much good as possible, which means that they have to make judgments. The only way you can do that is if you understand what the impact your saying or doing something is going to have on the people around you. Not just 1 or 2 people, which is simple empathy, but all the people around you, several layers out into the future, and groups as well as individuals. This is very, very complicated. It is not genetic. This is very like language. Everyone has the capacity for language. They have the capacity to do this. And every child knows it's really important because they know their first task is to figure out how to function in society. So they have the motivation, they have the capacity, but if a child grew up without anyone around them talking, they wouldn't know how to speak either. Children in this city who grow up in neighborhoods where the adults have a vocabulary of 1,000 to 1,200 words hit school and they never catch up. Same thing with these fundamental emotional skills. How many schools, how many parenting programs even talk about the mastery of sophisticated empathy? You need an entrepreneur to get people to see it and then to change the system. So that's what Mary is doing. Now I'm going to very intentionally take you to a quite different example. This is Philippa Vega from Columbia, and this is for the benefit of the business school people here. We have just announced a new program, which we've actually been doing at a small scale for years, to try to find social investment entrepreneurs. I'd like to find 40, 50, 60 a year, help them get started, succeeds over their life history, weave them together, pull out the unifying principles, which is what we do with every class of fellow. Now, so what's Philippa's idea? He saw that the way we finance education is as badly designed as you could probably imagine it. And like Mary, he said, okay, how do I change this system? Now, here's his diagnosis. All around the world, governments create schools, technical schools, universities, and they sort of create a number of places. If there's any correlation between market clearing quantity and number of places, it's a total accident. So what you end up with is too few places because not enough capital is flowing. And then the government does another crazy thing. They charge little, less than the real costs. Now, if you produce something that people really value and too little of it and you underprice it, what do you get? You have institutionalized cause of corruption. People get places for the people they care about in their family through influence. And that can be subtle or not so subtle. And all of you who know people who are trustees of universities in most of the world and have been at home at dinner in their homes, you can see this process every day. Every student knows that they are entering into a corrupt system. This is a structural cause of the corruption you were talking about earlier in this session. It's also crazy when you look at it from the point of view of the students. If you're a middle class or a poor student and you borrow money, which you probably have to, because even if it's only half the cost, it's still a lot of money for you. And what if you fall ill? You know, this thing keeps clanking and the costs and burden on you goes up. If you want to do something, work in a rural area, deal with social issues that are not so well paid, that's a problem. Well, so now, what does Philippa do? First of all, he's given himself permission to be an entrepreneur to change the system. So he has created what he calls human capital funds, which are for-profit funds that invest in groups of students. You can buy into one of these funds. He's got one right now for students with disability in Mexico. And you do not know what one student, veterinary student in Venezuela, is going to have as income. But for 5,000, you can pretty well predict what the pattern of income will be. So this is not a complicated process. You invest, the students pay back, and I'll explain how that works in a minute. The funds are designed to be quite profitable. Now, he's done 16 in a couple of years. As this gains credibility and track record, we're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars of capital flowing in to the education sector, which will end the shortage. There's a market clearing price because a fund that invests in students that don't produce enough income is not going to do well, and the Lipper rating service won't treat it well. You also have an incentive that the fund wants to tell the parents and the students which places you go might pay off and which don't. So you have an information flow that doesn't exist. And the deal for the students is it varies a little bit from fund to fund, but just to give you an example, 15 years commitment. If you're ill, don't pay. If you have a little income, you pay a small percentage of a little. If you have a big income, you pay up to, but not beyond 15% of a lot. Now, this is going to have huge impacts. This is one entrepreneur. If we have 40 or 50 like him, and you're all pleased, let us know if you know anyone who is an entrepreneur with an idea like this. Now, these two examples, you've seen the pattern. What are some of the common elements? And to speed things up, I'm just going to take you, these next two charts are in the back of that book. They haven't changed a whole lot. What are the criteria that we apply? If you were an Ashoka selection panel, which is the fourth of our 5-step process, first of all, is there a new pattern change idea? In both these cases, clearly yes. You could see how this would change the pattern across the globe. Is the person creative in goal setting and problem solving? Do they have high entrepreneurial quality? This does not mean leadership or management. It means that the person cannot come to rest until they have changed the whole system. Mary did not think about one class or one school. She will not stop until this pattern is changed, very, very broadly. And same thing with Philippa. They're in it for however long it takes. They're totally realistic. because what they care about is making it happen. The next is assume that the idea is demonstrated. You have one of these funds. Will other people copy that idea? Probably. So the idea has legs. Is it an important idea for the good? And then finally, ethical fiber. This is very, very important, and this is something I really urge you, as you would think about the methodology of business school, of working in this area. The reason we list this last is because it is not something you do by statistical analysis. This is judgment. People are very good at making these judgments, but it's tricky. We're afraid that we're going to have discomfort with difference as versus untrustworthiness cause a problem. And so we're saying, no, don't even talk about that. Well, this is a huge problem. As you move to an everyone a changemaker society where everyone is taking initiative, we have to rely on the people around us to have ever more sophisticated levels of empathy, teamwork, leadership skills. That's what ethics really is. If you don't have those skills, and if the institutions don't encourage it and strengthen it and reward it at every step, we have a fundamental flaw. Every time an entrepreneur asks people to do something, we're asking something very exceptional. We're asking people to do something unusual, and it's the words don't do it. People sense, whether we are married to this idea. You cannot talk to these two people without knowing that they are completely married. There's no difference between Mary and her vision. And you can trust these people. People are very good at making those judgments, and if they make those two judgments, then you can ask for the moon, and they'll say, how soon? If they don't trust you, forget it. Then just quickly, at the end of 5 years, we evaluate the results of our judgment. You cannot do comparative analysis at the beginning when someone has got a totally unique idea without comparisons. 5 years later, you can ask these sorts of questions. This is 7 years of data, and it shows basically that almost everyone is continuing full-time, that 90% have had independent institutions copy, and that over half have already changed national policy, which is more impressive than it looks because many people don't need to change national policy. Now, the impact of one person with a big idea is really an entrepreneur. Not a social worker who calls himself an entrepreneur, but the real entrepreneurs are huge. That's a huge force, but there's something more powerful, and that's us working together. And so I want to introduce a methodology that we've developed over the last 12 years, which I think has never been done before. When you think about entrepreneurship, you think about one person, one team, by themselves. And that's because business entrepreneurship is about capturing a market. Not true for us. Our job is to change the world. This is the one big difference between business and social entrepreneurs. Given that openness, we have been developing the methodology for group entrepreneurship. And this is a source of intellectual strength for everyone here. You can draw on this. When you have 450 fellows focused out of the 2,000, 2,500 on children, young people. Mary is one. That's one partial solution. There are many others. Different ideas, different delivery systems, serving different groups of beneficiaries or clients. But when you see the 450, you can see the overall picture. And out of that, we then try to pull the few principles that will really change the world, quite literally. So there are 3 tests. They're basically the same tests we apply to individual fellows. Is this principle historic for the field and for the world moving from a world of a few players to everyone a changemakers? If it isn't, we shouldn't spend 1 second more thinking about it. Second, is it a big win for the key actors in the field? Now, everyone in our field pretends that we have a business plan because scholars and grantors all want this. This is nonsense. If you're bringing in a fundamental pattern change, you do not know how it's going to happen in detail. You don't know how the pieces are going to work together. Your idea keeps evolving. It goes to different stages. But you do know if it's a big win for all the key actors. Think about Mary again. This is critical for the kids, for the parents, for the teachers, for the schools, for the society. Now, that doesn't mean that this is not going to upset people as they go through the transition, but it's a big win for everyone. But even that's not enough. So there's a third test. Society sits there with millions of interconnected pieces, which is why it's sticky. To get all that to change, to go to Mary's idea or Philippa's idea or anyone else's idea, you've got to have what we call the jujitsu force. Something that will drag society, and the entrepreneur is never big enough to do this directly. You have to set in motion a big force that will pull you from A to B. So competition is a good one. You can see Philippa's, you can see how both of these will work. All right, now, I wanted to give you that sense because that is yet another example of the change that the world is going through. These fellows, our field as a whole, are an engine driving towards this fundamental historic change that I now want to spend a few minutes talking about. Agricultural revolution, small surplus, few players. Clearly does not work anymore. If you're trained as an engineer or whatever and you don't know how to do change making, you're out of the game. And if you're out of the game now, think what it's going to be like in 10 or 15 years. I attended a lecture in Italy last summer. Professors showed this amazing set of charts, 80 charts in an hour, which is enough you'd die. But they were all basically the same chart, just different industries, different countries, different sectors. And they all show that the rate at which the rate of change was accelerating was logarithmic. So if you think it's fast now, imagine ahead 10 or 15 years. Now, many people are here to deal with management, so I'm going to just plant this seed right now because we'll come back to this. It used to be that if you saw one major change in an organization's life, you had time to deal with it. If you had a few people in that organization who'd focus on it. Think ahead 10 or 15 years. Not only will the rate of change on that one avenue be faster, but you're surrounded by change. The strategic environment is changing not on one dimension, but on all dimensions, faster and faster. The management model of one or two people, or maybe 3 or 4 change makers, is all you need to survive as an organization is cooked. You have to have in everyone a change maker organization to be able to survive in the world we're headed to. Right, so now, we're not there. There are major barriers that we have to overcome. And so what I want to do quickly is give you a sense of what I think is a central drawing engine, and then focus in on this biggest single bottleneck. The social entrepreneurs, the leading social entrepreneurs, and the sector behind them. Also the business entrepreneurs, but right now the social entrepreneurs are more important, are a very critical engine leading from a few players to everyone a change maker. Every one of these people is disruptive. Think about what happens at the local level. Something so simple as making sure that every young child masters sophisticated empathy, that changes a lot of things. It changes the idea that you can't change, that the way you've run your family is going to stay that way, the way the schools are run, the youth programs. There's a different model. Second, if she can do this, well, maybe you can do something. There's a role modeling effect that's very important. But the most important, and this is something that I think is not so visible, none of these people can succeed unless they are mass recruiters of local change makers. Mary has to get thousands of people across Canada, New Zealand, Germany, Seattle, whatever, to stand up and say, Mary's idea is really important, I get this. I am going to make this work in this school, this neighborhood. When that happens, that person, that group of people have become change makers, and they become role models for their family, the people they're working with. The more and more of them there are locally, the easier this gets. It becomes easier for the next ideas to flow in. This is a very contagious dynamic. People like to be powerful. They don't like to be pushed aside and not be actors. So that's very hopeful. At the global level, the Jean Monnet of our generation is the competition of the citizen sector organizations, because we can't solve our problems if we don't get global solutions. You get an international criminal court. Well, what's going to happen next is just what you're seeing. Organizations compete to get their issue in, to get their country in. Other groups will say, well, the human rights people can do that. Maybe the environment group will wake up one day and take some initiative at the global level. So this is a very, very, very powerful engine, individually and collectively. Now, so what is the biggest bottleneck? It turns out that if you don't change what happens with young children and then with young people, it's too late. If young children don't master sophisticated empathy, when they become young people, they're going to find it almost impossible to do teamwork, leadership, change-making. Those are the 4 sets of social skills that every young person must master before they hit 21 if they're going to be change makers in life. If you're not a change maker in the world of the future, that's a very sad story for you. It's a very sad story for society. Now, let me just ask you a second question before going into this. What is the key factor for success for any human grouping now and especially going forward? I'll give you a clue. It's not technology. The half-life of technical advantage is getting shorter and shorter, or marketing, same thing. It's what proportion of that group, whether it's a company, a city, an ethnic group, whatever, are change makers. Why did Milwaukee and Buffalo and Detroit and St. Louis, who are the heart of the industrial engine, die? Why did the lemon groves of San Jose suddenly become a center for our country? Well, as things go faster and faster and faster, if the U.S. does not increase the proportion of our population that are change makers faster than the competition, we will be the Buffaloes and the Milwaukees, and it won't take that long. If South Africa can go from 0.1% to 30%, when we go from a couple of percent to 4 or 5%, we're Buffalo and they're St. Louis. And the same thing is true for companies, for anyone else. To get there, you have to make this investment in changing what you do with young people. The reason I showed you the story of Mary is that goes right to the first part. You need more than that. There are other fellows that, for example, Jill Violette in California she's been going to the schools and saying, don't cancel recess, don't be afraid of recess as a source of chaos. Think of it as this is where children practice through group play the skill. How do you master something? You don't do it by concept. You have to practice and practice it. So those are 2 pieces of how these mosaics fit together. Then you get to 12, 6th grade. Kids are totally ready at that point to be change makers, and they have to be. And we treat elite kids this way. Elite kids, we expect them to take initiative. We send them to schools that at least tolerate it, in some cases encourage it. But in most schools, they don't. The adults are in charge of everything, the classroom, sports and extracurricular, if it still exists. It's sad. Just when kids have the most urgent need to do what they know is most important, which is to figure out how to be effective in society, we say, no, you can't play. We have to change that. We've created something called Youth Venture, which we've been working on, and it's very, very powerful. Any 6th grader, 7th grader, or for that matter, 17-year-old who has their own idea, a dance academy, a teen-to-teen confidential hotline, a tutoring service, doesn't matter. and they build and run a team, they leave middle school and they look back and that tutoring service is still going, they are powerful. They know it. They have already changed their world. They have been practicing these skills: empathy, teamwork, leadership, change making. We know what their life is going to be like, because when we do life history stories of youth ventures or the business entrepreneurs we deal with, you can almost always find that they started something when they were teenagers. Try it. You'll see it's very predictive. But that isn't what's happening for most kids. Now, how on earth do you expect someone who's 25, let alone 35, to totally redefine who they are, to develop these very complicated skills, to change the pattern of all their relationships? Isn't going to happen. And so can we afford to have another generation where we repeat having a tiny minority, the few players reproducing themselves, and everyone else out of the game? That's a very, very dark picture. So the entrepreneurs are a critical engine. This is a critical problem to solve. There are obviously other dimensions to this, but I thought going into those two would give you a sense of this. Now, what's going to happen? Let's assume we get 20% of the young people hitting 21 as change makers. Now, for those of you who are in business school, I'm immediately plunging into a relevancy for business, although it's true for everyone else. The first hotel chain that figures out how to run itself as an everyone a Changemaker hotel company will finish off the opposition. And we are actually talking with several hotel company owners about this, because we're trying to get both parts of the change moving. So let me get even more specific. What would that company look like? Let's assume you ran Hyatt for the moment. What if you decided that you have central strategic goal is you've got to make Hyatt and everyone a Changemaker company? Well, what would that look like when you succeeded? All the people in that company would be saying, travelers. What do travelers need? They need a lot of things, not just bed, potatoes, beer, the 3rd century idea. Right now, for example, travelers are going to have to learn how to live in an everyone a Changemaker world, and their kids have to master this. Right now, the citizen sector is hugely a center of attention because we're growing much faster than any other sector. We're growing employment at 3 times the rate of the rest of the economy. We have the elan. You know that the best students are heading into this area. Well, how does someone who doesn't have this background learn about it? Well, I've just given you some examples of needs that are pretty broad. So Condé Nast, working with us, did a little survey. They found that 55% of travelers would very much consider doing a vacation trip for social, and 24% now actively want it. What is Hyatt doing to serve that need? What could it do? Well, now, when you start thinking about all the different subcategories of travelers and all their different needs, and you begin to think of the hotel company as serving travelers broadly, then you need all your employees constantly looking for new niches of need. How do you develop it? How do you make it economic? How do you constantly change it? The first hotel company that does that will demolish the Ritz-Carlton and all those other people. And that's true for any business. I'm just going to give you a different example of the relevancy for business. We have a very big citizen sector that's come up. This is a completely different structural environment than was there 5-10 years ago. Some quick numbers. Let's see if I'll go through this quickly. This is the number of organizations. The blue line is the citizen sector. The yellow in the middle is all other. Bottom is religious congregations in the U.S. You can see who's growing. People in Germany say this is not happening there, but of course it is. Since 1990, the only sector growing employment is our sector. business and government have both been absolutely shrinking in employment. You were looking at BRAC earlier today. Well, who is the biggest organization in Bangladesh? By a factor of 4 in terms of full-time employment, and that's not even counting their employees in other parts of the world. And we talked about the internationalization phenomenon before. These are way underestimates. We've never bothered to register because we don't get anything out of it. But so this is just the officially registered. Now, this is a very different world. Within every country, you now have a big citizen sector that's growing really fast, that's attracting very talented people, that has a lower cost structure than you have, that has very strong, trusting relations with key parts of the population. Now, if you are a business strategist and you stop to think about that for a moment, you will say, uh-oh, I need to think about this really carefully. If I partner with these people, if I co-venture with them, I can get major strategic advantage. If I don't, I'm going to be blindsided by people who do. And Ashoka is, in fact, working on this. Our hybrid business social value-added chain work. We are still offering a prize for a better name. Hybrid value chain is the short of that wonderful trip-off-your-tongue name. The idea is very simple, that we now have, instead of a business sector that took off and became entrepreneurial and competitive, and the citizen sector wallowing in pre-modern mess, which is where we were in 1980, you now have 2 sectors that are entrepreneurial and competitive. The citizen sector has largely caught up. And the first people who figure out that we need to change every business system in every industry to take advantage so we don't have a business system and a social system serving every need and not talking to one another, which is the madness of the structure we've had for the last 3 centuries. Now we can actually bring them together. And every time we do that, guess what happens? The customer gets a much better deal. The citizen sector organization gets a huge new revenue flow, which means that they get to be independent of government and foundations, which is our secret wish, not so secret wish. They get to serve their clients in a really important way. They get a comparative advantage for a few years as a first actor against their competitors in the citizen sector, and the company gets a huge new market. This is a huge productivity deal you can do all across society. Now, I decided to be very concrete and give you those 2 examples. When you have as fundamental a pattern change as the one we are going through now, from a world of a few actors to everyone a change maker, every institution in society has to change. As that happens, the strategic environment for every other institution changes. I can only just begin to give you some sense of that. Right now, the social entrepreneurs and what they are triggering, and the alliance with the business entrepreneurs, and very, very, very importantly, the alliance we have to build with the people in this room, the intellectual intermediaries who are smart enough to get this and help articulate it and help other people see this historical roadmap so they can see what's relevant for them. We've got to work together to get society over an awareness tipping point. This has been building for 300 years. It's now reached the point that the most important thing we've got to do is get people to see it. Let me just test you on a question. If you have a 15-year-old niece and you see that she is failing at math, what are you going to do? Well, first of all, you know you've got to do something. That's expected of you. You're going to be a bad uncle or aunt if you don't do something. You're going to fire the principal, you're going to hire a tutor, you're going to talk to the parents severely, something will happen, and you have a repertoire. you know the sorts of things you should do. Now, what if you notice that that same niece was not practicing change making? First of all, would you notice? And then what would you do? Well, now, success for all of us in this room is 10 years from now, every aunt, every parent knows that they have to be looking for that, and they know what to do. It's the same thing for business managers, for government managers, anyone who's running an institution. You cannot continue to run a few players organization. It won't work. You will lose. You will do a bad job of being the trustee for that institution. But if you don't see that, if you don't see this historical change, how are you supposed to know how to deal with this? So the people in this room have a huge power. If you can help people see this historical change and see the relevancies to them, individually, their family, the people they care about, their careers, their kids, and to the institutions that they're responsible for and care about, you've done something really important. And if we can help, we're very eager to do that. And I just say before, Marina Kim is a classic entrepreneur. Ashoka is intentionally, as you might imagine, in everyone in entrepreneur society. We're trying to figure out how to manage that, I'll be honest with you. But she is entrepreneuring the bridge amongst people working in the universities, in the intellectual community more broadly, trying to figure out how we can all do a good job here and how to build the most useful bridges between the operating people and the thought leader people. So so I think we now can comments, questions, thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Okay. But while you're all thinking, this little red book you should realize is the Indian Penguin edition. And talking about international trade, etc., think $1 instead of 28. It's a big advantage. Since some of you are not from the university, I'm filibustering, so break in any time at this point. I occasionally fess up to the fact that I also went to law school. And I practiced for 7 weeks, so I probably am not in too big a hole. But it's not just business and management, but think of the other fields. The brilliance of the common law is, how do you have a system that self-adjusts in a very principled way to changes in society? That's what the common law does. You have a change in the economy, there's a new situation, the lawyers come to the courts and say, apply the principles you've always had to this situation in this way. And then the judges, checking one another very carefully, say, yes, we are being true to the principles of the law by adjusting to this change in reality. That has given us a legal system that doesn't seem to change, but actually does change. And it changes in a very principled, not political way. It's a brilliant invention. What does the field of law do, which is geared to a 12th or 13th century rate of change, when we go up that logarithmic curve? Now, think of your friends in the law schools. Who is going to think about that if the law schools don't? Every field is going to have this sort of challenge to it, which is why the universities, as much as businesses, we all have to be everyone a change maker organizations.
Well, since you were talking so much about all of those formative years, that by 12, these kids should be change makers. What happens if you're a university professor inheriting a classroom of 19-year-olds, maybe half of whom have gotten it by then? What do you suggest we do in the classroom?
Oh, this is a wonderful, thank you. This is great. The universities can do a lot. With those students, but also reaching out beyond the universities. So we've actually been talking with NYU and several others about this. first of all, let me deal with the students here. At NYU, there's a campus-wide youth venture competition every year for students 20 and under. And they, just like anyone else, if they come up with an idea and a team and it promises to be a permanent change, we're thrilled. You know, that probably means that those young people have some of the skills, they've resisted some of the pressures, and quite likely they come from families of few players and have been to those sorts of schools. If you can encourage them to know in their own life and their own experience that they have this power, that's a gift probably more important than anything else that happens. And Youth Venture would be thrilled to work with you. What Youth Venture does, we try to find, we'd like to see 100,000 young Americans every year, and we've now spread it out to 20 other countries and moving out quickly, have their own idea, build their own team, and look back and see they have caused a change. If that 19-year-old does that, that's fabulous for that person, but also for many others. The average Youth Venture team has 20 or so kids working on it, 3 to 5 in the core group, low 20s who are tutoring, doing 3 hours of the virtual radio program a week or whatever. They are by definition all practicing empathy, teamwork at least, and they're certainly getting the idea that they can lead, and they're watching people do that. Some of them will go on and start things. You know, at a middle school or high school, which is smaller than a university, if you have a 500-person middle school and you get 2 kids to succeed in doing this in the first year and 3 in the second, that's 0.5% of the kids succeeding per year, roughly. At the end of that time, you've got 5 peer groups committed to doing this because it's their idea, not the bandmaster's idea. Selling to their peers, come and join our organization, listen to our radio station, use our tutoring service, play on our lacrosse team, whatever it is. And by the way, this is pretty important, cool. And we are at the cutting edge of this transition to an everyone a changemaker world. And I assure you that young people do not resist that. It adds a whole extra level of meaning to what they're doing. So if you have 5 peer groups like that, peer groups are powerful, multiple peer groups are more powerful, 100+ kids, you have a good shot, not a guarantee if Captain Queeg is running the school, but you have a good shot at tipping the whole culture. And then that becomes a building block so that all the kids that come after are being recruited and trained and rewarded and respected for doing this. And they're telling other people, every time you put one of those in places, it's contagious. And ultimately it builds up to the whole society going through the awareness tipping of the women's movement, of the civil rights movement. Very analogous here, except this is for young people. Plus, you have the added argument, this is critical for getting to everyone a changemaker for everyone. If America or South Africa or Poland or the Iranian American diaspora, whatever group it is, wants to succeed, you got to do this, and we're at the cutting edge of this. There are very few people who resist that argument. So you do that inside the university, but I think the universities are in a particularly strong position to open the doors in the high schools. There are a lot of students who want to come to this university and to other universities represented in this room. If you, and we'd be very, very happy to partner with you on this, if you want to send out a mailing at the beginning of the terms in the high schools and say, this is a university that believes that the world has got to produce a lot more change makers. That's one of the things we're trying to do on this campus. But we know you got to start earlier. This is really important. And we are telling you with the credibility of a university that this is pedagogically very important. And we have a partnership with Youth Venture. Youth Venture will do all the processing. Any young person from this high school who becomes a Youth Venture, then they'll have certain opportunities on the campus, and we're going to look at you seriously at admissions, and you put something up on the admissions website saying this is a campus that cares about people who are going to be leaders and change makers in society, and we have these programs and courses, but we're reaching out. Now, any school that does that, you're going to get the best students because you're saying, we respect you, we trust you, we expect you to be powerful. Kids hate being treated the way they're being treated. They're not articulate about it. They hate it as much as African Americans hated being treated they were in the 40s, although they weren't challenging the system. Or the women before the women's movement. They knew something was wrong, but help crystallize it. You can ask very simple things of the principal. Please put this up on your intranet or at least on the bulletin boards at the beginning of the term, and we can provide you with those materials, work it out as a joint thing. So, I think we, if we're trying to cause this sort of change, everyone wins by being a pioneer in the effort.
When you talk about change makers, it doesn't really imply any kind of direction. Any kind of directionality, and probably in your program you have maybe a generalized understanding that it means change towards things that are generally socially beneficial and whatnot. But what about if a group, and I'm just thinking, there was probably a change makers somewhere in the Midwest that got Tom Sawyer banned from the reading list because, or the other change makers that wanted to get the teaching of evolution banned from the curriculum, and I think many people would consider these to be very negative changes. I mean, especially groups that are trying to pursue a fairly particular, the interests of very particular groups. But have you encountered that, and do you have any way of sort of, passing any kind of, review over what the directions of changes that people are proposing?
It's a really good question. Let me answer it on two levels. The simple one is that Ashoka does look at that third criteria, the social impact of the new idea. How far will it spread, and how beneficial is it? Well, there's some judgment about beneficial. I think there's a much deeper answer that gives me great optimism about how and everyone a changemaker world will work. You can't be a changemaker unless you're very skilled at the skills that underlie ethics. To be a member of society where you're not just following rules, you are a self-guiding actor, you have to have very, very high level of skills at empathy, teamwork, etc. What is that? It's you're really understanding the impact on the people around you, the institutions, the society. That's why sophisticated empathy or cognitive empathy is so important for young children. That is the single most important thing for people to master if they're not going to be marginalized, to put it negatively, if they're going to be able to express love and respect in action, which is what almost everyone wants to do. That's how we become a part of society.
Because, again, for instance, in some arenas, especially in the Islamic world, for a lot of people, ways to effect change involve terrorism and blowing oneself up. And I mean, because of strong commitments and a sense that these are important things to do. But how would that, I mean, they're change makers. But so how, they would, I see you're saying that they would get ruled out because it doesn't express empathy, it doesn't express concern for others. I guess that's how that would get filtered out as a legitimate type of change to make.
See, the reason I think your question is so good is that we're going through the transition between the agricultural world of a few players and everyone else is still in a pre-modern, just do what your mom and dad did, and if you don't, Zeus will cut your hand off in some way. The prophets of the great religions of 2,000 plus or minus years ago, when they were dealing with the first axial age, they almost all had to talk at two different levels. They had to talk at one level for the small elite that had moved into Jericho and give them the new empathy-based system, the Sermon on the Mount. But they also had to spend most of their time talking in parables that would still be useful for the other 99%. Why do you speak in parables? Cast thee not pearls before swine, lest they turn and rend thee. The fact is that Gandhi recognized that in the last century we had made the transition where everyone has to master the new empathy-based way of living. That's why you can go to a society, and as long as you get the people in that society through drama to themselves make a judgment, a choice between a behavior pattern that is inconsistent with really respecting others, people don't have a choice. They're going to change their behavior. Now, we are in the midst of this extremely difficult transition. There are some very negative counter eddies. I'll just give you another one that for the people from management schools here that is, I think, is very concerning. Because we have this bottleneck with children and young people, we're already into the stage where the demand for change makers is escalating rapidly, but the supply isn't. As a result, we have a huge bidding war for an inadequate supply of change makers. That's one contribution to income inequality. But what it's doing also is, instead of encouraging organizations to move to an everyone a change maker structure, they're having to bid and struggle to get a few people, and it's making those organizations more hierarchical.
Yeah, I would think that it's pretty me that a principle that you would have to formulate, sort of a Kantian principle here, is that you would have to respect others as change makers. And that's the difference, because if you just did it yourself, I mean, Hitler was a change maker, but he didn't want to respect others as change makers. But being a change maker in a way that respects others as change makers is pretty complicated.
It is very complicated, but that's what an everyone a change maker organization is, and society.
Yeah.
And absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question. Sam, one more question? Yes, Louise?
First of all, thank you for coming, and congratulations on the work you're doing. It's super just thinking of when you're deciding who to fund and which projects to work with, do you see this in a systemic fashion? I mean, do you try to say, okay, this project may undermine another project that I'm funding because different people may have different ideas of what would be most beneficial to solve poverty or whatever else we're trying to solve. So, but sometimes they are contradictory. Perhaps, I don't know, microfinance may lead to incentives to have more business, but that may harm the environment. Perhaps somebody else is trying to help the environmental issues at the same time in the same country, and maybe you're funding both. I mean, do you try to think of this in a systemic fashion?
Very much. I think what we're all working at is, how do you build how people work together, where everyone is a change maker. It's just a different model of management, and it's not limited to one organization. It's the family, the school, the business, the citizen sector. Government is mired in pre-modern and really needs help getting out of that. Frankly, the universities need some help also. But that's where we are. We're very rapidly evolving these new mechanisms. You know, the internet and all that's associated with it, my mental image, that's sort of like a body spontaneously developing a nervous system just in time when it needs one, where more and more people can talk to one another and share. And so much of the challenge we have is how to do that intelligently. So the second dimension of Ashoka is all about this. The first level, we find the best ideas, people, institutions without any preconceptions, but with a value component. Ethical fiber is absolutely essential. It's one of the 4 criteria. Help them get started, succeed over the whole life cycle, weave them together into a community. And the second level, I referred to the mosaics earlier, where we take all the people who are working on a common goal and help us think and act together. Well, that, I think, will turn out to be the single most important process for the field. And this is a global process. Now, obviously, full economic citizenship, law for all, changing what happens to young people so they're powerful then, all these, they reinforce whether they fit together. They're all pieces of the new world that's coming. And coming back to the point I was making earlier about the contribution that this community can make, to the degree that you help everyone see that that's what's going on, then they will know how important it is to build these bridges. And they'll have better criteria in thinking about it and be more ambitious in thinking about it. But when you go, the problem is we've only been through one transition this big before, and the last time it took several thousand years. Now we've got, this is all going to happen in decades, and it's been building up, and so we right now are at the most exciting. I'm not sure that's what the Chinese proverb is, but it's a big challenge. It's wonderful. And so everyone here, all your students, the alumni, the high school students you can influence, you can just help people see the map and then challenge them to figure out how to help find the way through the transition. What's relevant for them, for the people they care about, the institutions they care about, and overall.